Namaste everyone. Thank you all for joining our fifth webinar, part of our Northeast Hindu YUVA's webinar series, Hinduism in the 21st Century. My name is Jannavi Ganesh and I'm the co-coordinator for the series and a rising sophomore at Rutgers University. I'm also the treasurer of Rutgers Hindu YUVA. Hindu YUVA is a student-run, nonprofit, sociocultural organization with a presence in over 35 universities in the United States. Our aim is to practice, promote, and preserve our Hindu identity while growing up in the United States. Before I begin introducing our topic and moderator for this evening, I want to thank you all for watching last week's webinar about the queer Hindu spectrum, which had more than 2,500 viewers within the last 7 days. Throughout tonight's event, viewers watching live on YouTube and Facebook are welcome to comment questions they have about the topic, and we will be choosing unique questions for our moderator to ask our speaker. Without further ado, our topic for tonight is the Divine Shakti, the journey of femininity in Hinduism, being moderated by Vidhima Shetty.
Namaste everyone, and thank you Janvi for that introduction. It is my pleasure to now introduce our speaker for today, Drishti Mae ji. Drishti is the president of the National Hindu Students Forum in UK. Founded 29 years ago, NHSF is active in almost half of all universities in the UK and reaches over 10,000 students annually through its activities. Drishti is passionate about the space that universities can provide for students to explore Dharmic values and their identity during their formative years. A graduate of chemistry from the University of York and the Unilever Future Leaders program, Drishti now works in technology at Unilever in the UK. So thank you so much, Drishti ji, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So why don't we just dive in and we'll get started with the first question here. And again, thank you everyone so much for coming. I'm sure we're going to have such a wonderful, insightful conversation ahead. So first question, Hinduism arguably has the strongest presence of the divine feminine among major world religions from ancient times to really the present here. So to start off, I would love to hear your thoughts about what our society and the individual has essentially derived from this religion where goddesses play such an integral role. And I'd also really encourage you to use this question to maybe talk about your background and your personal identity as a Hindu female.
Wonderful, thank you. So first of all, to everyone who is viewing at home, namaste. It's really nice that we can connect in these times, you know, across the water and come to explore these pertinent topics. So I think to begin, you know, when you and I spoke, we spoke a lot about history and what we've seen as an evolution of our culture, you know, and we spoke about we have such strong, striking women within our scriptures, within our literature. We have women who have authored parts of the Rig Veda, who, you know, many of whose names have been lost to us. We have women that we can read of in the Upanishads that are so deeply inspiring in so many different ways. We have women who, you know, were Kshatriyas, who have defended Dharma, who've defended their land and defended their people. And so we're surrounded by so many parts, so many different role models through history, through time. But we've also come across and come against, you know, other sides of history where we're looking at the position of women, we're looking at what's happening in society, and looks quite different. And so I think what is a shining light, and I'm really glad that you've asked this question first, is that our culture is rooted in deep values, you know, that have come, that are incredibly old. If we look and if we count the oldest civilizations that have existed, the greatest civilizations that have existed, the Hindu culture and the Hindu civilization is the only one that is still existing today. And there's something to be said about that. There's something that is able to persist and not only continue to exist and survive, but also, as we're seeing now, thrive, you know, across the world. So something to be said about those values of our culture. And so I'd like to dig in a little bit deeper into that. So your question, I think, was, you know, what can we take from the divine feminine? And I think in this time that we have, what is really beautiful to be able to reference is that within our culture and within, Dharmic scripture and literature, you find this concept of balance. You find this concept of, I think it's called, you're going to mind my pronunciation now, but Ardhanishvara. And that is where you have the balance of Purush and Prakriti, so consciousness and matter. You have the balance of feminine and masculine energies, not to compete, but to cooperate with harmony, to create something beautiful, to create something that persists. And I think just to start off with, I think I'd point to that. That is something that I think all of us as young Hindus and, young people who will look to explore what Hindu Dharma is, will come across. And that concept of balance is, I think, one of the most central, but also one of the most important ideas that we can look to understand, dissect, and internalize.
Absolutely. Thank you for that beautiful answer. And I completely agree essentially with everything that you said in terms of values. And also, I really like what you brought up about the historical sort of aspect that we have rooted. And I'd love to bring up a question here. So sort of after looking through some research and understanding that actually within sort of our ancient scriptures, in the 10th chapter of the Rig Veda, in the Devi Sukta hymn, the feminine energy is declared as the essence of the universe, the one that creates all matter and consciousness, the internal and infinite, and really the metaphysical and empirical reality. A mouthful here, but essentially it asserts that the feminine is the supreme principle behind our universe as we know it. And so I'd like to take this account into take this historical representation of femininity into account. But I also think it's really important to note that in traditional society and perhaps aspects of our society today, we've seen females really be subservient to their male counterparts, as women have limited freedoms. And she's really been seen as, unfortunately, this dependent entity. And so in seeing the representation of women in the scriptures versus the reality that they claim, the space they claim there, how should we reconcile this disparity? And maybe you can bring in your ideas of values here that you'd like to discuss.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great question. So I think the first thing is that context is so important, right? I started off by saying that, we are part and inheritance of the oldest civilization, living civilization that there is. And so our heritage, our culture is vast. It is also very, very old. And in that time, humanity has seen a lot. We will, as a culture and as a civilization, have had really real highs, but then also we will have had real lows. And in that, some values will persist, some values will be remodeled, some values will disappear. But what is constant is that there is an evolution. There is a constant evolution. And it's not necessarily a revolution, but it is an evolution. So I think that first, that context is really, really important. So when we look to historical texts, and I'm going to put scripture aside here for just a moment, but when we look at historical texts, you will find some really fascinating things. So if we go back to the 3rd century, you will find, there's books out there, and you will find that young girls were educated. Young girls could take the same education as young boys, which often when we talk about Hindu history, we often miss, we reference things that don't necessarily acknowledge that. But they could take the vow to become a brahmachari. And back in the 3rd century, it was so that they would be educated and would be expected, as boys were, to approach marriage around 16 years old. Now, what's really important to note then is that this was in context with the life expectancy. So we cannot and should not apply modern 21st century values onto this when we're saying, oh, that's really young, or, to be able to judge. So that's first thing. So 3rd century, you had education, it was there, it was present. Girls could go away, but then also within the villages and within the communities, education was provided for young women. By the 10th century or so, We start seeing a rise in life expectancy. Starvations is, starting to be minimized, and overall society is starting to thrive. And in that, we also start to see the age of marriage increase. We start to see not only education play a central part for young men and young women, but also you hear of women being trusted as the king's guard, far more trusted than young men, because there was an expectation for young women to overthrow the king. And so you have women that are trained in military, you have women that are trained in martial arts, so on and so forth, who, are not seen so much differently from boys in that sense, in terms of equal opportunity. And then as we go on, I talked about highs and lows, ebbs and flows, things start to change. So around the 12th, maybe the 13th century, things start to change and they take a turn. And in this time, we start to see women being confined to the home, women being married off earlier. And we can see this as a decline of culture. But again, context is really important. And it's around this time that, the cultural memes, the cultural values, the fabric of society had changed. Islam had come in. And so the root that was present in society, the rules that governed society fundamentally changed. And one or two rules in particular that I'd like to call out. So it was lawful in that time for any Muslim man to be able to take a young unmarried woman as his own. And so in this effort to protect culture, to protect tradition, in order to protect women, we start to see the introduction of a lower age for marriage. And this is a pivotal point where history nudged our ancestors, I guess, into a different direction. We start to see that age of marriage lowering. And we still, can talk about child marriage and so on and so forth. We can, again, evolve out of that. But that is where we start to see this happening, where the age gets lower. So this context is really important for us to consider, right? So the cultural values are there, they start to get eroded, new cultural values come in, and that has repercussions for society. It's also around this time that what I mentioned before about education and diversity in education starts to collapse. So a lot of educational institutions were decimated. And that is for young boys and young girls. But add that with the fear and the need to protect young women and the changing environment for women, and the idea that actually women should stay at home and women have a role to provide that was now pervading the land, suddenly the position of women changes. Suddenly the role of a woman changes. And we start to see some of the values that still irk us today.
Amazing, amazing. I absolutely love what you said about context, because that is 100% so important. Whenever talking about something, you should understand the sort of time frame and the sort of expectations that existed at that period. So 100% agree with what you're saying. And as a sort of follow-up to that question, you did talk about child marriage and how that in the context of the time that it existed, it did seem right. And so I'd like to ask, what are your thoughts on, besides child marriage, other traditional practices that women have been sort of forced to engage with, such as sati? And how do we as individuals today approach these topics? You had mentioned context as one of the sort of fundamental features whenever discussing these, but I'd love to know if there are any other sort of tips or sort of approaches that you'd have when we talk about these topics in the light of Hinduism, essentially.
Sure. So I have a question back for you, Vidhima.
Yes.
And that is, so you mentioned child marriage, and I think we've discussed that. You then mentioned sati. Are there any other essentially taboo topics that you'd like to point to? Because the reason why I ask that is that we can talk about sati for sure, but I'm not necessarily aware or, aware that it actually exists today as a practice. So if you could just give me a bit more color, that would be
certainly. It does not exist today as a practice, but I wanted to understand, in your perspective, as we talk about it today, what should we be keeping in mind when we approach those sort of topics that were prominent in the past? Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure. So I first should declare that, you all know my background, not a historian, but I'll give it my best shot from my understanding. And from what I've read and from what I know, sati, if it did indeed, exist in the way that we read about it, wasn't necessarily something that women were forced into. And I think that's what I would take issue with in terms of if such practices did exist. Would they have been in that light? And the reason why I say that is not because I'm a scholar or have knowledge about something, but because of what we've just discussed. There was a time where there was a clash of cultural values. There was a clash of, different rules. So that you had rules and law that was not in harmony with the cultural values of the land. And in that time, people can do things that may seem extreme to us today. People can do things that we would look at and say, that doesn't make sense. But when the human spirit and when a people cannot create, they cannot sustain, sometimes we are driven to destroy. And I think that's the best context that I can give from the position that I sit in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I would like to go back. I know you mentioned us having wonderful female rulers and really amazing female figures. And so I'd like to ask, so throughout history, we've seen some of these female rulers such as Jhansi Ki Rani, religious figures and saints, and honestly, philosophers such as Maitri. And I'd like to ask you, how do you suppose the divine feminine, so goddesses, have influenced these individuals, and by extension, the sort of community around them?
Wow, okay. So how has the notion of divine feminine, so I guess we're
the prominence of,
Sure.
Sorry, yeah.
Sure. So I'm gonna apply this in today's context, if that's okay, and then try and apply it back. Okay. Sure. So, and the reason why I'm going to do that is because I can't speak for the history, but I can speak to what we can dissect today. So I live in the UK, you live in the USA. If we look at the framework, if we look at the cultural foundation of the places that we live in, and if we look at it and if we talk about it openly and honestly, it's an Abrahamic construct, right? And so if we look at media that we consume, if we look at movies we've consumed when we are younger, leaving aside Bollywood, but that when we are assimilating with the land that we live in, what are we influenced by and what are we exposed to? Everywhere we look around us, there is a paternal figure. There is a form of God that is quite often male, maybe genderless, but quite often male, referred to in the male. And that then has repercussions in society, that has repercussions on our language, that has repercussions on what we read, what we consume. Sometimes it is very explicit, sometimes it's very subtle, and we consume it. And what we consume therefore influences our thoughts, it influences our behavior, it therefore influences our aspirations also. What I think is really beautiful is that within the Hindu culture, we don't have just a one-sided view. We have a balance, and I keep coming back to this point, but we have a beautiful balance. But also you have utsavs, so festivals that are dedicated completely to Devi, to the feminine divine, or to the divine feminine, where we're celebrating, fertility. We're celebrating the act of creation. We're celebrating life itself. And so I would ask the question, how many other living cultures are able to do that so consistently and with such love and with such, embracing it as a whole? It's not only women that celebrate these utsavs. We can look at Durga Puja, we can look at so many different instances, we can look at mandirs, across the world that are dedicated to the divine feminine. And that is, again, if I were to deconstruct that into my worldview, that would be that actually there is something to learn from each. There are times when you need a masculine energy, there are times where you need a feminine energy. But it's always to bring it back into balance. And so for different contexts, for different situations, you might look to meditate upon something different. And within our tradition, we are a plural tradition. We have those that will say that I'm praying to a god, I'm praying to a different energy. But then you will also have those that will say that in this act of puja, in this act of arti, what I am doing is I am acknowledging and reminding myself that this potential, this latent potential is within me. All I need to do is practice to immerse myself in the right environment with ideas from different directions to educate myself, and therefore look to fulfill my swadharma, and therefore flourish as a human being. And when we flourish as human beings, we are net contributors to society. And so in our culture, we're not saying that there is one particular way. There are many ways. And that is done with balance of both the masculine and the feminine. But absolutely, the feminine has a role to play for not just for women, but for men. So to come back to your question, I think, it may not have been perhaps exceptional for there to be women philosophers. It may not have been exceptional for there to be women who fought. It may not have been exceptional for women to, go into Vanvas and take that next step in life. And I think, again, we're looking at it thinking, oh my God, this is amazing, right? These women inspire me deeply with what attributes and what character and what skill they portray. But we're looking at it from our point of view. So I like to just play devil's advocate and say, maybe it wasn't exceptional, but we can still draw inspiration from the ideas that they may have drawn inspiration from, but also from their acts, from their lives itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, like you were saying, context is very important, is what I'm really understanding and sensing from this. So that makes complete sense. And I like the point that you brought up about how females have been so present in terms of, let me rephrase this, the material that we consume in terms of art and culture is reflective of the way that we think as individuals, and therefore by extension society, like you mentioned. And so I'd like to also bring up the topic, since there's so much feminine essence in Hindu religious art. For example, Sanskrit literature has contributed to the religious and spiritual expression of women. And we see that, of course, goddess Saraswati herself is the goddess of arts, music, poetry, speech. And so I'd like to sort of ask you, how do you see the essence of femininity in arts and culture? How has that changed over time, or has it changed over time? And what are your thoughts on that?
Wow. Honest with Imaji, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer a question on art in that way. I will definitely say I absolutely appreciate art, and every trip that I have had to India, it's been actually wonderful to see that, that not only is there a representation of both men and women, and and more, but it's never felt and never come across that actually only men can be artisans, only women can be artisans. And I think when either tap into art, there is that point where you can go beyond, where you are tapping into something greater than who you are, and yourself as an individual with certain ideas. You can come to that state where you connect with something deeper. And there are some pieces of art that you will view, I will view, people watching at home will view, and you will know that the person or the people who've created that art have tapped into something beyond themselves. And that is a connected experience that we can have. And I guess that's all I can comment to on that question.
Absolutely. And thank you for sort of applying it to definitely as much as you're aware of. I definitely should be cognizant of that. And so I'd also like to take the opportunity to ask you a little bit about your personal journey, how you sort of came to Hinduism, if you'd like to talk about your background in that. And I know we talked about a lot about values, but I'd also love to understand, important to yourself, what are some of those values, cultural attributes that you'd like to share?
Sure, absolutely. So as you've mentioned, I didn't grow up in Hindu Dharma. I actually grew up in a Muslim household. I grew up in Islam, and growing up, I had lots of questions. There was a lot that didn't make sense to me. And my personal experience was that my ability to question was rather limited. So there were questions about anything divine. There were questions about the position of women. There were questions about why things were different for young boys and girls that plagued me. And tried as they did, my parents were not able to satisfy my curiosity to the point where I could accept the culture, but also the ideas and the religion that I'd grown up in. I'd grown up having the women around me being very much inspiring domestic capabilities. I had women around me that, got educated simply to get married. Now, that was my personal experience. I'll just caveat that there. But the men in my experience had enjoyed and had the ability to enjoy far more freedom. And that always, I guess, was there. There were questions around vegetarianism. There were questions around, morality. There were questions around how can you truly know that God exists, and who the right God is, or what the right God is, or what is there? How can you confirm it? And I was obsessed, I guess, with the ability to be able to go outside of Islam to be able to look back in. And so by, in my late teens, I was quite comfortable with the label of being an atheist. And it was at that time that I somehow stumbled into a course studying both Greek and Indian philosophy. And that was where I discovered the Mahabharata. And I kid you not, I absolutely fell in love. Absolutely fell in love, because here was a young girl, young woman who had grown up being given rules, being given rules to the point of what hand to eat with, how to greet people, what is the right approach for every micro thing that you can think of, all documented in books, all documented and also administered and decided upon by men. Versus coming into reading the Mahabharata, where the good guys are doing bad things and the bad guys are doing good things, and so, a whole moral maze. And reading the Mahabharata, reading any piece of Hindu literature, what is beautiful is actually you will have so many different perspectives. You are not given one single answer. You're actually given about 10, 20 questions that you then have to go and either try and resolve or keep thinking on. And every time you return to it, you come away with new questions as you as an individual evolve. And so I went into my late teens discovering this, went into university where, as we were speaking earlier, I set up something called the Eastern Philosophy Society to continue this exploration. And it was around the same time that I'd come across the National Hindu Student Forum. And here was a community of young people looking to explore, looking to embrace all types of Hindus, to not declare superiority in any sense, to be able to really dive deep into discussions and not debates. And there was something beautiful about that experience that drew me in, but also allowed me to explore myself, allowed me to explore history, allowed me to explore philosophy a lot deeper. And so I guess that came together, and over the years, the more I looked into it, not only exploring my ancestry that is from India, but also knowing that actually at some point my family would have been Hindu. Marrying that with the philosophy that I'd fallen in love with, the culture and the tradition that seemed so in flow with science, that seemed so in flow with my experiences, to the point that I could understand them, was beautiful. So for me, it was a journey of a few years where I felt then comfortable enough to call myself Hindu. And this is what's really beautiful about this, is that as I'm going through this journey, there are people around me that can see that I'm on a journey of exploration. And they would happily field questions. They would happily show me how they do puja at home. They would happily invite me in and talk about the cultural values. They would happily talk to me about the difference between men and women. They would happily talk to me about different aspects of philosophy and also the different darshanas that exist. And all that time, it wasn't under the guise of toleration. It wasn't under the guise of suspicion. It was with true acceptance. And that is something unique, something that we often negate or don't take stock of. That our culture and the cultural value that we have has the ability to accept, not to tolerate, but to accept and to embrace. And I guess I feel really fortunate now that, not only have I been embraced by the community around me, but I've been given what I would see as, the most, a real privilege to be able to lead the largest Hindu student movement outside of Bharat. I don't know how many could be as fortunate as I am. So very, very blessed. But I think more than me talking about myself, that this is a testament to the Hindu community and the rising maturity. We are going through a form of evolution where the memes and the ideas that have shaped us are changing. They're being critiqued. We are monthening internally, but also we are adapting. And there's beauty in that ability to adapt as well.
Wow, Drishti ji, it's so amazing, frankly, really, just to hear your religious exploration, reckoning, and this sort of reconciling with Hinduism. And I 100% agree. Having grown up in a Hindu household practicing Hinduism, there is this genuine sense of just realness, embracing, and acceptance, which I wholeheartedly admire and which I love about Hinduism. And it's so wonderful to hear your journey and how you sort of want to bring the community into this and how it revolves around community for you. So absolutely beautiful. And sort of as like a fun question based off of this, as you were sort of exploring Hinduism, I would be really curious to know, who's your favorite on the topic of goddesses and divine Shakti? Who is your personal favorite goddess or goddesses? And what are some of the traits or attributes that they sort of showcase that appeal to you?
So I think I have to say, and it is genuine, Saraswati Mae, right? And once we have an appreciation of history, once we have an appreciation of our global snapshot, right? Everything else can come if we are educated. Everything else can come if we are open and earnest, but also encouraging of exploration, encouraging of questioning. And so when we go into the student sphere, when I think you mentioned it right at the start, young people are going through their most formative years. And if we go back, at least to the history in the UK, we existed in a time where young Hindus were too afraid or embarrassed or not comfortable with calling themselves Hindu. We've had that time. And over the years, we've dived in deep. We've looked at actually how do we bring people together, but also how do we explore, and not in a dogmatic way, not in a here's what's written in a book and now follow it, but actually genuinely explore. You and I can have completely different experiences, but also different worldviews. You may be a theist in some form of a deity. I may be an atheist. Somebody else may be agnostic. Somebody else may only believe in material matter. But there is a commonality that binds us. There is a commonality of cultural values that brings us together. And only a mature society can accept that. Only a culture and a tradition that is mature can accept such diversity. And I think, in our modern day, diversity is such a hot topic, but it requires maturity of a society to be able to accept. And so I think, whilst I generally don't have favorites, because you've asked this question, I would say Saraswati Mae because of what this deity represents and how essential it is throughout time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. So one more follow-up question I have before we jump into some viewer questions. I absolutely love what you said about, formative years. It's really important to sort of instill perspectives within children as they're growing up so you can embrace these perspectives and carry them on in the future. And so I'd love to ask you, if we're focusing on the family unit or sort of family life, how can families ensure that when raising a kid, they are instilling within their children perspectives and thoughts of equality, specifically with feminism, maybe like wanting to debunk traditional sexist stereotypes? And like you were mentioning, maybe elaborate a little bit more. How can we use and integrate Hindu beliefs when teaching them these things?
Great. So I think what we're pointing to is, why do we sometimes treat our boys and girls differently?
Exactly, you nailed it.
How can we combat that, right? So I'm going to point to my previous answer, education. But I think also, Vidhima ji, you and I and young people just like us have a duty and a role in this to play. Krishnamurti said something really beautiful. He says that if you have the ability to respond, you are then responsible. And I think that really does apply to us. There are so many of us that are saying, there's a problem here. Why can't we talk about periods openly? Why can't we talk about menstruation and all the associated illnesses? Why is it that, there are certain things associated? I think you were mentioning about childbirth, but also why is there a particular rule applied to young boys versus young girls in terms of domestic duty, so on and so forth? Now, I think that is changing. From my personal experience, I have the good fortune pre-corona, pre-COVID, to be able to travel around and visit many homes and visit many young people. And I think things are evolving, things are changing. But I think we have a role to play in this, and we can either stand on, the side as spectators and say this is wrong, and raise our voices against it. Or we can actually look to, with love, with karuna, with compassion, look to engage in dialogues to deconstruct where sometimes these ideas come from, where they exist and persist. We can look to identify actually what is the nucleus from where this stems in a particular household, in my household, in your household, so on and so forth. So I think first, you and I have a responsibility and a role to play. And I think I just want to start with that foundation and with that baseline. And then I think as we do progress in these discussions, we do need to understand, I think, the perspectives of the generations before. They've seen a very different world to us. And so by us speaking in the language that is familiar to us, we're not always necessarily coming through to generations that see the world differently. And there's a beautiful concept called Purva Paksha, to be able to see things from a different perspective and to be able to entertain that book, not outright reject it and say it's wrong, but to be able to entertain it, build that capacity and compassion within yourself, and then look to have a discussion that will probe it further. And I would say that actually that's something that our generation has a responsibility to entertain, to immerse ourselves in, to say, okay, here is an individual in front of me, here is a family member in front of me, here is a community leader in front of me. And I don't necessarily agree with the ideas that they are propagating or promoting or keeping alive. Okay, how can I approach it? And it won't be a blanket approach. There will be different rituals that we may look to introduce. There will be different discussion forums that we may look to introduce. It may be that actually we strike up and start up a personal relationship with somebody so that we can have a dialogue where that person feels safe and then can look to deconstruct and open their minds to different ideas. And maybe we'll learn something too in that process.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That is such a beautiful way of phrasing it. And I 100% agree. The needs to not just stand on the lines, but really be able to foster these genuine conversations that frankly do need to be happening and are happening, such as this. And so I'd like to move over to some of the audience questions, because a lot of people are rooted in this conversation and I'm sure they have a lot to say. So one that I am seeing right now, why are women asked if they are independent? When women have so much, who has corrupted the society to start thinking that women are only respected only if they are of a higher positions, or I'm assuming of a higher powerful stance?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So could you perhaps rephrase that question for me?
Sure. I'm assuming that what this question is asking is that why are women who essentially have higher power, let's say a political leader, versus someone who is maybe a homemaker, why are those women looked at as differently? Why are they not treated essentially the same way, is what I'm understanding from this question.
Sure. So that's really a societal question. And I think that, again, comes down to the culture that we're steeped in. So where something is normal, where something is very prevalent, perhaps we wouldn't have those questions. And so I would say that, one, we perhaps don't necessarily always have a deep value or appreciation of the family unit, absolutely. And there is a role that mothers play that is integral to society. You can look through history, and actually a lot of times we've seen that to decimate a culture, to deconstruct ideas, women are often targeted because they are seen as the custodians of the environment, of the culture. And so mothers and homemakers have a really important role to play in society. And maybe there is a growing understanding of this. Whereas women who will choose to pursue their careers, who will look to, who are sometimes the breadwinners of society, again, they are performing a role that is necessary for themselves and for their family and for the people around them. So I think from what I've understood of the question, why does this happen? I think this is from the cultural norms and memes that surround us. Again, I would say that this is tipping. It's not a question I've experienced or seen women that I respect and look up to as role models being questioned on, but I would say that it would come back to the norms of our society. And as we have more diversity coming up, I'm sure that these questions will diminish and cease to exist as well.
Absolutely. Beautiful answer. And I 100% agree with what you're saying in terms of how society is reflective of the way that people think, but by speaking more about it and speaking up about it, we have the ability to shift away from those sort of perspectives and mindsets and bring upon something better. And I know earlier, I'm going to shift around here a bit. We talked about, and I know you like this topic, about feminine and masculine energies. And I also wanted to expand upon this topic, but apply the idea of feminine and masculine energies to societal structures or organizations. So let's say like maternal or paternal organizations or structures. Can you maybe talk about how these exist within our daily lives as we know it? And do we have a balance of these energies? Because I love what you were saying about how important it is for an individual to have a balance in these energies. And similarly, is it important for society to have that balance of energies of maternal and paternal, or feminine and masculine as well?
Sure, great question. So I think if we start off with an organizational structure, or if we start off with a corporate structure, we don't necessarily question or really quibble on the role of a CEO, the role of a COO, the role of a CFO, right? We have titles that are quite clearly defined, and we have roles that are defined. Now that will change from company to company, that will change from organization to organization, that will change sector to sector in the nuance and maybe some of the detail of what those individuals in those roles and in those capacities will do. But we have a fairly good idea. And the reason why I'm pointing to this is not to say that things are hardly defined, but is that we have the ability to accept that different people have different roles to play. And this depends on the skills that they have and the aptitude that they have. And I think we can mirror that back into society. You will have a certain nature that will incline you to pursue particular activities. You will have passions that you wish to pursue. And you will also have responsibilities that you will have. I'm not saying that only particular responsibilities will fall to you, Vidhima ji, as a woman or anything else, but as a family unit, we will have several responsibilities that need to be completed. And what I think your question is pointing to is actually, is this hard, or is this organic, and can this be as diverse as we, in an ideal utopia would wish it to be? And I think it is. So a woman may feel more inclined to take up certain duties within the home. A father may be inclined to take up certain duties. A child will also then be in that home, be instilled with certain values to take up some responsibilities. Now that is to ensure the functioning of the family unit, which will then, if we scale up, look to secure the functioning of a samaj, of a community. Now, home to home, family unit, those will differ. But we will know that someone will have to do certain activities. Someone will have to earn money. Someone will have to look after the home. And so by taking into perspective each individual's nature, each individual's skill set, and each individual's inclination, different people within a family will take on different roles. Just so happens that for a long period of time, we've seen familiar roles, or we've seen roles that feel very specific, so we've seen women traditionally be the householder, the homekeeper. We've seen men traditionally be the breadwinner. But we're also now seeing the inverse of that. We're seeing the opposite of that. We're seeing different hybrids of that. We're seeing different types of home units. And that is absolutely fine, but as long as we acknowledge that everyone has a role to play. I think that's what I'm getting at. And so that, I think, is really important to note. So it's not necessarily a notion, I think, within the Hindu tradition that, absolutely everyone has to have the same outcome. Everyone has to halve things straight down the middle. And, Vidhima ji, you will do half the chores, and your brother or another male in your house will do exactly the same on a different week. That's not what it's pointing to. It's pointing to that actually we will all contribute in our own way. So you may take certain tasks up, and your brother or a male in your house may take up certain other tasks, but you will equally contribute. Take that up to organizational level, which is, I think, the second part of your question. I think, the far more interesting part as well. What I have experienced and what I absolutely admire is the Hindu management system, right? So leadership within the Hindu construct is different. You lead from the back, not from the front. You are often quite invisible. You focus on the well-being and the mood and the pulse at the grassroots. You're in touch with what are the needs of people around you. But also, you work on a consensus model. And why is this important? So, and what do I mean by consensus model? So often we may go to Betaks, within our student societies, etc., and we will think, oh my goodness, this is taking forever. Everyone has to have a say. But the beauty in this process is that everyone has had a say. Everyone who has felt that they, have an important point to make, and often they do, has had the ability to share that. Other people have commented, and we've dissected or actually put aside or embraced whatever point that is. But it means that everyone from an emotional perspective is bought in and engaged. And when we do make a decision, it's not democratic in the sense of we've all voted on it, but it's actually each and every individual around the table, each and every individual that is going to help make this a success is bought into it. They understand the why. They've discussed it, they've monthaned it. And so when that step is taken, when a decision is put into execution mode, every single being is behind it. Now contrast that to what you may experience at your internship or at your job. It's actually someone senior up has said, this has to happen, and people will scramble to do that, sometimes with resentment rather than with brain power, rather than looking after the people around them. And you suddenly create two very different environments. And so I would refer to actually this model, this consensus model, this Hindu way of management is quite maternal. It's looking after the well-being, the aptitude, the passions and concerns of everyone involved. And what is so important about this is actually that when you progress, it is not dependent on one person's ego, one person's personality. People can come and go. The organization will still move on. And that is because when progress is made, it is sustainable. Because everyone's moved with it. So you can interchange people and you can still have that consensus and move forward. And that for me is quite striking, quite beautiful, and something that I deeply admire.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love the way that you framed that. And it's honestly a spin on the perspective that I had sort of understood, because these are, like you had said, going to Baytux and really hearing that everyone has a say in it. It's such a beautiful way of thinking about this inclusivity, these principles of unity, and really understanding. And I love what you said about leading from the back. So essentially leading invisibly. That is an utmost and beautiful principle, I think, in terms of leadership. And so on sort of the conversation of leadership, I would like to remark about something that I've noticed. I've seen that in India, for example, we've seen significantly higher amounts of female leadership in India. For example, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And I was wondering, do you think, as compared to the West, for example, where we've never had a female president to date, do you think that we've seen these female leadership positions or occurrences in India as compared to the West because of Hinduism or because of these sort of maternal leaderships, like you're saying? Maybe if you can elaborate on that.
Sure, and I guess this would be simply speculation on my part. But what I think I will point to once again is actually that this notion of women in leadership positions, women actually looking to take a responsibility, isn't alien to us. It isn't something that is absent within, scripture, within our literature. You can go in and read, versions of the Mahabharata where women are so empowered. They will pursue what they want. They will pursue things that will contribute to their family. They will absolutely take charge to protect their family, their dynasty, so on and so forth. So these memes that are stitched into the fabric of our culture embrace women in various leadership positions, whether that's subtle or whether that's outright, whether that's pronounced or it's not. So I think to answer your question, it's not so alien to us. And so perhaps there is a far more willingness to embrace it.
Absolutely. And so going off of that, how do you think maybe we can adopt these ways of thought and maybe shift that towards the West, the people who don't necessarily practice Hinduism, but who honestly should want to adopt these sort of beliefs?
Absolutely. So I think what is really interesting to me is that where you and I live, there is a shift in our culture happening. You can call it a Hindu Renaissance of form. There is a rise, there is a jagrati of the values that shape our culture. And so we as a young generation are becoming far more educated, far more nuanced in actually, what does it mean to be Hindu? What does Dharma say? We can come across concepts like Heath, Meet, Breathe, which I'll go into in a little while if you'd like, which help shape what the right action is. And there is almost a treasure trove to explore. However, if we look at the mainstream narratives that exist in the world that you and I occupy, the mainstream narrative is not reflective of our inner reality or what we may explore privately. So there is an opportunity, and I think also an imperative or responsibility, to be able to marry this treasure trove of cultural values that look to honor humanity, that look to uplift society, to sustain society, if we go to the root of the word dharma, and marry that up with the language that you and I have, marry that up with the platforms that you and I have and others like us have to be able to speak. So is there an opportunity? Absolutely. Again, I'd come back to that point of responsibility. As this Renaissance is coming, as more literature emerges, as narratives start to change, what will you and I do in that? We've got an absolute responsibility in this. So we should be writing, we should be, pursuing further interviews, we should be looking to explore these ideas across lots of different mediums. And I think that is happening. And I think that it can only continue as, so long as we have these sorts of discussions.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well said. I'd like to move on to a viewer question now, and perhaps the answer that you gave here can be very applicable to this question as well. So over the years, we have tended to cast a negative light on very human, natural female processes such as menstruation, for example. So how do we educate and realign ourselves in thinking about this process and shifting our thoughts to not look at it in a negative light? And perhaps how can we go about doing this using Hinduism as the vehicle for reshaping that collective thought?
Absolutely. And I think, again, you've hit the nail on the head. There's a point about education and awareness. So first, I think we need to become comfortable about talking about it and not necessarily allow invisible pressures that we may feel to stifle the dialogue. But also, if we look towards our culture, look at Navratri. In certain parts of India and now parts of the world that we occupy, we have a tradition, we have an utsav that is very much celebrating the process of creation. It's celebrating the power of womanhood. And so everywhere we look within our tradition, you've got Prakriti and Purush together. And so this notion of creation is so central to what we do. But can we connect the two? Menstruation, back in the day, we didn't necessarily have the means and the mode for sanitary pads or sanitary napkins that we do today. And so the constructs that existed for where women did stay at home or they didn't were relative to those times. We now live in an age where actually you and I can do whatever we need to do. Women can take on the responsibilities they need to and manage with menstruation. And so the context has changed, but our dialogue has not. So can we open up that dialogue and can we educate? Absolutely. But also we can just reference our culture, creation, womanhood, all of that is all around us. So I think there's an opportunity to open up dialogue. And I think sometimes it just starts with that. The more you introduce something, the more you talk about something, the more normal it becomes. We can start with our friends, our mothers, and then expand further to start to question and really deconstruct why some biases or perspectives may exist.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love this sort of recurring point about the necessity of conversation, of dialogue, to essentially shift that dialogue and not adhere to those mindsets that we previously sort of would foster and pass on, essentially. And so I love that point, and also follow up, because I love the point about how you said that we can have strength, like as females, we have the power to talk about these subjects. And similarly, I'd also like to ask you, how can we as a society draw strength from Hinduism to also fight issues like misogyny or sexual harassment or other issues that females see themselves undergoing and that need to be talked about?
Sure. So we could even start with something simple as the word namaste. Every one of us says namaste when we come to Hindu society events, when we come to webinars like this. And if we were just to take a moment to reflect on actually what that is pointing to, I think there's something there to really dig into. The divine in me honors the divine in you. We are already acknowledging that there is divinity within you, there is potential within you, there is consciousness within you. And the consciousness within you is the same as the consciousness within me, is the same as the consciousness in my next door neighbor, is the same as the consciousness in my father, my brother, so on and so forth. And what we are caught in is a web of circumstance. But we always have the opportunity to act differently in that circumstance. Always remembering the idea that actually in Hindu Dharma, we are equal and we have equal potential. And we therefore are working our way through life, working our way through this Leela, looking to expand that potential and bring it into reality. And I think if we can dive in deep into that idea, actually this idea of misogyny, this idea of inequality starts to dissolve. Because when you've internalized that your life is worth as much as my life, is worth as much as my neighbor's life, and your right to education, your right to discussion, your right to be able to go to work, so on and so forth, you can apply it to so many different things, is equal. Then a lot of these constructs dissolve, but you then have to go deep into this philosophical narrative. So from a Hindu perspective, actually, we as a community can actually just look to reflect on and internalize the word namaste and what its connotations are, what its meaning is pointing to. And if we then start embodying particular character traits, if we then start working in a particular way and then therefore showcasing and modeling organizations that work and flourish, where men and women equally are able to flourish and be successful, we can then look to pursue institutions that promote education in the most earnest sense. We can look to promote institutions that encourage dialogue in the most inclusive but earnest sense. We can then look to construct organizations that will look to raise finance, that will look to pursue, financial success, but in a way that is sustainable and in harmony with the world that we occupy, with respect to Bhumi Mata. We then start showcasing a new model of living, a new perspective, a new version of success. But it must start with the individual, scale up to expand beyond our family, beyond our community. And if we can keep expanding that notion of I, of mine, of what I have a duty towards, we then start to influence a lot of structures, a lot of communities, a lot of individuals within our vicinity that are around us, that are listening here, so on and so forth. But it starts there.
Beautiful. I definitely agree. The individual is what essentially offsets that chain and ripple effect. And I love what you said about it being as simple as something like namaste, which is just so beautiful in of itself, the meaning and the sort of connotation it carries towards the sort of individual that you're interacting with. And I think it's a wonderful way to actually circle this up and bring it to a close. So I'd love to hear, before we hop off, any closing thoughts that you have, anything you'd like to bring up that we haven't had a chance to cover, anything you'd like to maybe leave our audience with in terms of this topic, your personal experiences. Would love to hear.
Wonderful, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this dialogue. In terms of closing remarks, I think I'll echo what I said earlier. We are living in extraordinary times where there is so much in terms of what we experience on social media. The pressures on young people are changing. What is being promoted at universities, what is being championed by academics, what is being discussed at a political level. There is so much going on. There is confusion, there is uncertainty, so much. And in that, we also see that the Hindu community and the Hindu culture is being revitalized. It's shedding practices, it's shedding parts of itself or parts of what it had evolved into that are not conducive to humanity, that are not conducive to human flourishing. And an earnest ascent is happening, an earnest rise is happening, an earnest renaissance is emerging. And we are part of it. And in that, we have a role to play. We have a role to explore, to question. We have a role to then also be vocal. And I don't mean that in the sense of shout, but actually be present. Exercise your civic duty. Be part of the community where you contribute. And you can only contribute to the best of your ability, but the more you do so, your ability expands. And so I think we live in extraordinary times. I think there is an opportunity to contribute. And the more we pursue this, actually will start to level out this dialogue, where we talk about differences between men and women, where we talk about differences between feminine and masculine traits. And actually we can come to arrive at a harmonious balance. Now that won't be tomorrow, that won't be next year. It is a long journey. It's a long journey that we are, on the trajectory of. But it does require you and I and everyone like us to be committed to it, to be willing to explore, to not dismiss things at first glance, but to dig deep and absolutely critique that which does not seem right. Absolutely call out that which is arcane and not relevant. But then also embrace and be proud of what is beautiful, be proud of what is conducive and what is relevant. And let's not shy away from it. Let's embrace it. Let's talk about it. Let's share it. Who knows what could happen? So thank you.
Thank you. What a beautiful, powerful statement to end with. Be a part of the evolution. That's beautiful. Well, namaste, and thank you so much for being here with us, Drishti ji.
Thank you so much, Drishti ji. That was amazing, so insightful, so powerful. I loved it, every bit of it. So thank you so much for speaking about your perspective and sharing your stories about all of this. We really, really enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
So if all of you are interested in learning more about National Hindu Students Forum, please do check them out and all their social media pages. And also thank you so much, Vidhima ji, for being our moderator today. I didn't get to introduce her earlier, but for all of you, she is a rising sophomore at Columbia University, and she is also the president of Hindu YUVA at Columbia University. She also wrote a book on chronic fatigue syndrome, and all the proceeds she raised from that book, she donated to I believe, Open Medicine Forum, where they aim to find a cure for the disease. So thank you, Vidhima ji. And I would quickly like to introduce our webinar for next week. So our webinar next week will be Hindu Social Thought, Decoloniality, and Global Human Rights Movement by the very well-known Sai Deepak ji. He's an engineer turned lawyer who specializes in litigation and constitutional law in India. He's well known for his work on cases pertaining to freeing Indian temples from state control and also regarding the entry of women in the Sabrimala temple. So join us next week for our 6th webinar to hear his brilliant insights regarding this topic. Please be sure to follow our Northeast Hindu Yuva pages on Instagram and Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch all our previous and future webinars. So thank you all for joining. Dhanyavad and namaste.